Hey everybody, this is Dr. Law. I'm hoping this records well, so we'll see. Making this video, if people show up live, that's great. If not, it's okay. I'll be providing this video later on for further information. This is a continuation of the prior videos that I've shared in regards to diagnosis, case conceptualization, and treatment planning. And now I'm going to add more into it when it comes to case conceptualization. My goal is to be able to take information you've learned from prior classes as well and to integrate them into this as a whole, so you understand why you have to learn all this stuff and why there are so many requirements in a master's program in mental health and how to use the information. So today's topic is using topics such as human growth and development, or developmental theories, and other types of theories, and to be able to apply them to a client and understand what is going on, why it's going on, and how you can use that information in working with a client. So I will continue using the same client information that I have in the prior videos with this character that, hopefully you guys can see it up on the screen. I gave him the client name Johnny, Jonathan Johansson Esquire III. No, that's not his name. And birth date is roughly the same. It is, he is around that age. Don't worry about the 52-year-old. That is incorrect. We're not going to worry about that. So in prior videos, I talked about the diagnosis that happened with this client, that ended out with this client. And I want to start with that. As I said before, this is an old version or an old copy that I have of a case conceptualization and assessment. So you'll see the old DSM-4 axes diagnostic criteria. Just please ignore that. The thing we're going to focus on right now is that he has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder, mild, recurrent, without psychotic features. Now, the reason it's in that order is because the post-traumatic stress disorder is what really kicked in first, and he began to develop a major depressive disorder afterwards. So that's why it's that one and then the other one after that. Now, let's talk a little bit about, let's move back up here into his biopsychosocial assessment and whatnot. Let's talk about how developmental theories help us to understand Johnny. So there's some information in this assessment that I purposely left out, and that's for the reason of discussion. And that is, it has to do with his upbringing. And so if I were to take this assessment and add more to it in the biopsychosocial history, it would include who he was growing up, all the way up from birth into adulthood. That way we could get a picture of what went on. Ultimately, what went on in his life was socioeconomic status-wise, he was on the lower end. He was at not quite poverty level, but lower class. His father did not involve himself in Johnny's life at all, and so he never really had much of that. The little he knew about him was that he had done criminal activity and really didn't show much of an affinity for being heavily involved with the family. Johnny spent most of his lifetime outdoors, loved the outdoors as a child, loved the outdoors as an adolescent and as an adult. His mom was involved as much as she could be and worked full time to take care of her and his siblings. And he would go on to also say and explain that during school years, he was severely disabled, that he had a reading disability as well as a mathematical disability. He never really learned to read or write. He was put in resource and then into special education classes specifically for those problems: reading, writing, arithmetic. And it was a very sore subject for him, because even though he couldn't do those things, he had other strengths he was very good at. Anything that involved physical activity or activity that required hands-on work, he was very adept at. He could figure things out in his head very quickly and then put them into play. Such things as an adult is he was very good at working on machines, machinery, engines, other things like that, and he'd never had a formal education. That is what helped him to get his job working in the oil fields and in natural gas pipelines. He became not an engineer, but more of a mechanic, and would work on the machines to make sure they were running in proper order. He would also rebuild car engines, motorcycle engines, or even just the entire machine itself on his own. As he said, he just had a knack for it. He could figure out how things work, fix them up, put them together, and have them work better than they did before. So he definitely had strengths. He definitely had many things he could do that some of us can't do. I can't do the things that he would describe that he was good at, but the things that I'm good at, he couldn't do either. So working with him was actually a joy. It was getting to know a side of this guy that was so rich with knowledge and so rich with experience that I thoroughly enjoyed talking to him about things he loved to do. In fact, our long-term goal with him, and I'll get back to the developmental stuff in a minute, was to see him to finally feel good enough to get back into doing those things, to finish rebuilding a Harley Davidson that he and his deceased son had started rebuilding. It had sat in the corner of his garage for a couple of years. And so we wanted to see that and wanted to see him back out in the outdoors, fishing, spending time with his other son and his grandchildren, and doing things that he enjoyed and was good at. So having said that, now let's take a look at some things here. Make sure I can get the right stuff. One moment, please. Okay, share and developmental models. Let's get these up on our screen. Okay, talking about Johnny. Here we go. This is where all this stuff you guys have learned can help you to begin to understand him. And I'll provide more information to explain how this applies, how this helps us to understand, as well as how to work with him. As I got to know him, and I started to look at Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, my understanding of him got so much better. And it also helped me to know how to approach him. For example, in talking with him, I learned about his growing up years, infant to 18 months, trust versus mistrust. We already know that there is a family member that is out of the picture, not involved, not helping. And he talked about how, as he continued to grow, having friends or many friends or trusting people was difficult. Mind blown, imagine that. We look right at this model right here, and it says trust versus mistrust is developed in that first 18 months. He didn't have his dad around. He didn't have other family members specifically around that he needed. His mom was present, but she was so busy. She did all she could. And frankly, with what she had, she did a good job. 18 months to 3 years, we look at the psychosocial crisis or task of autonomy versus shame and doubt. During that time period, the truth was he was being allowed to do pretty much anything he wanted where they lived. And he was encouraged to do things. He learned how to be autonomous. Shame and doubt began to show up actually later on when he started to see that he wasn't as he said, as smart as other people. Initiative versus guilt, that began to kick in around 5 years, 6 years of age, as he started going to school and he began to see more and more that he couldn't read, he couldn't write, and he was made fun of. So guilt started kicking in. Then 5 to 13, industry versus inferiority. Again, there were issues that were occurring. He was industrious with the things he could do, and so he gravitated towards those things. Again, I'm talking about the hands-on work. Inferiority, that happened when he couldn't do those things. He couldn't read and couldn't write. In fact, when he came to my office the first time, the only thing he could do was sign his name. He said he knew basic math at that point, so he could pay his bills and had been able to pay his bills throughout the years. He even told me himself that he believed he was just dumb. So here he was in his 50s and was calling himself dumb. That's inferiority. That's something when it comes to competency. Again, that's the virtue being developed in that 5 to 13 years. He developed it partially in areas where his strengths were, but did not develop it in areas where he had that disability. 13 to 21, identity versus confusion. He had a lot. It was in his teenage years that he began to act out. He began to break rules of school, get in trouble, get suspended, things like that. And then as he moved on, he began breaking the law and doing other things. He had been put, I believe he had actually spent time in juvenile hall in juvie. I do know that he did spend a night or two in jail. And he did say that during those first few pivotal years of adulthood, he was on a fast track to prison. He said he had friends who had actually killed other people and he had knowledge of it. But what had changed him, and this is where these developmental theories, they help us understand. As he was starting to get into that 21 to 39 years range, his desire for intimacy began to change. He began to date. Not only was he doing all these things that he probably shouldn't have been doing, but he started to date. He met his future wife. They started dating. She got pregnant, and he said it was like waking up from a fog. He decided that it was time for himself to become a man and to be an adult. He no longer wanted to be isolated. He wanted a family. He said that the birth of his first son, the one who later on, when he was 22 years of age, passed away, he changed his life as well as his relationship with his spouse. He found an identity as a father. That identity as a father trumped all other identities that he had had before. One as a son, as a brother. In fact, as an adult, he didn't have much relationship with his prior family. But that one thing he wanted to do, and he wanted to do it well. Now, how well he did it, it never really came up. We do know that during that 21 to 39 years of age, intimacy continued to be the most important virtue, or the virtue of love was what he was working towards as he raised his two children in conjunction with his wife, and then later on they got a divorce, but still remained friends. When he came to work with me, he was right smack dab in the center of the 40 to 65 years where generativity versus stagnation happens. At this time, career-wise, he was at the pinnacle of his career. He was making very good money because of the several years he'd been working in his career field and because of his skill set. He didn't need those things that he had a disability towards. He just needed what he knew, and he excelled at it and loved it and found pride in it. What really did it for him, obviously, was the accident that happened with his son. But also what it did is because he had such a severe post-traumatic response to it, and then afterwards an aversion to the type of work because of the dangers of it that it posed, not only to him, but also that it posed to his son and ultimately led to his death. His ability to be generative, to take care of himself, to provide for himself was nearly gone. He was no longer able to work in that type of career field. And so these things, this theory and these stages help me to understand the client. We're going to move on a little bit more on how this helps us more. We're going to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we look through this, through Erikson's stages of development and compare them to the hierarchy of needs, there are parallels to it. The bottom need here is physiological needs: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, all those types of things. All those things are first supposed to occur during these first few pivotal years. Because if a child's environment is not providing those physiological needs, their ability to develop trust, not only in their environment, but also in people who are supposed to give that to them, it doesn't develop, and the ability to develop hope is stunted. Similar things happen with safety needs, love and belonging and esteem. And so we can see that these things occur in a similar fashion as the developmental stages. of Erik Erikson. It's fascinating to see this. So how does this help us with Johnny? Well, as we start working with him, we see that his physiological needs are being met. Not as well as they used to be, because he's not making as much money as he was before. But because he does have a temp job, works for a temp agency, he makes enough money to pay his bills. His house is paid off. His vehicles are paid off. Again, he used everything with cash because his ability to do other things he just couldn't figure out, and so he did what he did best. He used everything with cash. He'd pay cash for his vehicles, he paid his house off, and then everything he always did with cash because he could keep track of things better. So physiologically his needs were being met. But if we look back at that generativity thing, he didn't feel like those needs were being met because his income had been drastically cut down. He felt guilt for it. He felt ashamed for it. And on top of that, add the post-traumatic stress and feeling depressed, the guy just felt horrible. Safety needs, personal security, employment, resources, health, property. He had those. But again, they were tied into that feeling of guilt and shame. Love and belonging. This is where it starts to get difficult with him. He had friendship, but not many. He pushed a lot of people away. Intimacy, he had a girlfriend, they were close. She wanted to get married, he didn't. He had his son, who he was trying to work on the relationship with. He had his grandsons and a few other friends and family members, but he did not feel very connected. Ever since his older son died, that loss was so pivotal to him that he felt like he had lost a part of himself that could never be gained back, and that was being a father. Esteem, because that love and belonging was hit so hard, everything above was pretty much knocked out. His self-respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, and sense of freedom were gone. Before his son died, they were there. He felt better and believed they were there. So because that's gone, self-actualization is not happening and cannot happen. And so this gives us an idea of where to start, actually, in treatment. It has to do with the harm or the damage that happened with this, love and belonging, and safety. And so our treatment goals would parallel that, work on helping him to feel like he has a sense of safety in his life. And not only that, that he has love and friendship. And so some of that took talk therapy is what we can call it, or just good old-fashioned person-centered counseling, helping him to look at what he has, helping him to look at his strengths rather than at the things that he does not have anymore. Also, it took a lot of grief and loss therapy. That was very hard. Not because his son was gone, but because it was the way that it happened. And so add grief and loss with post-traumatic stress, it was very complex. So to help with that, we needed to help him resolve or move towards some resolution to where he felt like he would be okay. So that meant that the PTSD symptoms needed to go down, his sense of love and belonging needed to go up, so that eventually his esteem could kick in again. Used many methods with that. With him, we used eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and it worked for a little bit. For some reason he got stuck, and later on as I worked with him more, we found that the reason he was getting stuck was because of his anger and his desire for justice, and even at one point revenge. Anger does nothing. It's a normal feeling and it's natural, we all have it. But in this man's case, his anger towards the person whom he held responsible for the death of his son trumped everything. And he could not get past that point. And so full resolution, honestly, during treatment was never attained. I wish it had been, but that anger piece just was too much. So that's what we worked towards, though. And we had our goal. We didn't fully make it, but we did make it to certain points. I hope at this point now you're seeing how this helps us understand and gives us a picture of the client, and how I used Maslow's hierarchy of needs to get an idea of what level we're working at. Now, another piece of it, I'm going to go back to this. When it comes to that part of that intimacy piece and that feeling that he has a sense of belonging and love, okay? In this theory, in this development pattern, we see that occurring mainly in 21 to 40 years of age, intimacy versus isolation and love. We know this client is well beyond those years. He was in his 50s. Gosh, now he'd be in his 60s. That means we would need to be working with an individual at that level. What I'm saying there is sometimes when you're working with somebody who didn't quite meet, let's say, a crisis or a task, didn't quite fulfill it, it may feel like you're working with someone who's younger than is in front of you. And at times that did come out. When there was guilt or inferiority or confusion or isolation, the way he talked, the way he presented himself was not at that 50-some-odd-year-old level man who was capable of living, but it felt and he spoke at a much younger level, almost as if he had gotten stuck. And that is not a bad thing. I believe that is a normal, natural process for everybody. I don't believe that these stages perfectly match an age. In fact, newer theories that take this model have gone on to state that it's more of a fluid process than just a stage process. So Maslow's hierarchy, will come back to this. And now, I was going to go over Piaget's, but the truth is we could look at that in conjunction with the other theories and get similar things. Now I actually want to move on down to how to measure if things are actually going on in treatment. So we had these ideas, we know what levels he is at, we know what levels of Maslow's hierarchy we're working on, but we got to have an idea of how is this treatment going? Is there any change occurring? The stages of change model. Very, very helpful. It's not just helpful for folks who are struggling with addiction or with substance abuse or anything of that nature. Although that's originally what it was intended for, you can find the process with clients who are struggling through a myriad of issues. Pre-contemplation is when the client has no clue that there's really a problem. That means they're not even thinking about it. It's just not there. Those of us on the outside look at it and go, yeah, there's a problem. But they're not there yet. Contemplation is that point where they start to recognize there's something going on. Determination, moving towards action. This is where the fun starts to happen. Determination is that point where a person recognizes there's a problem, recognizes that they want to change, but they just don't know how. They're not sure what to do. So there's still a sense of hopelessness. They're like, oh man, I just don't know what to do. And that's where we can come in to play with them. Action, they're working on it and they're moving forward. Action stage takes time, but it does speed things up. Before somebody gets to action stage, you'll see them bounce from pre-contemplation to contemplation to determination again and again. They'll just move back and forth. With Johnny, that's what happened with his anger. His anger was such a wall that it did not fully allow him to go from determination to action all the time. And sometimes he'd be in action and we call it a relapse. Means that the symptoms would return again because he just fall into old habits and things like that. He'd return back again. Again, it was just a stumbling block that he needed to work through. An interesting thing about him is he really believed that he would feel better and that anger would go away once his lawsuit against the company as well as the person he held responsible for the death of his son was done and that he had won. The sad thing is I never got to see that because as soon as he completed treatment or completed his lawsuit, and he actually did win a sizable amount, he disappeared, never returned phone calls, never came back. And that was a very sad thing for me because I wanted to see this guy through. But again, I want to go back to that anger piece. That anger piece was just resistance And that resistance would make him go from, oh, yeah, there's a problem. Oh, yeah, I need to work on this. I don't know how to do it. I'm working on it. Oh, now I'm pissed off and I'm going to go back again. I'm just going to be angry again. That's what happened. As his therapist, it was hard to work through, but there's lots of things you can do to work through resistance. Motivational interviewing is just one of many, but that's one that you will commonly hear about. That helps a client work through resistance and the stages of change. So, moving on back up here. Go back to Maslow's hierarchy. That is how you can take these theories that you've been learning about and how they help you to conceptualize a client and who they are, what they're going through, and to really get a strong picture. And also, this is how you can take those theories, apply them not only to the conceptualization, but the treatment plan and the outcome measures. I know in prior videos I've talked about different ways to do outcome measures. There are many. This one right here was one. I know I've talked about you can use assessments throughout the treatment process and see if there's a decline in symptoms, things like that. That's fine too. A lot of therapists will just use the client's self-report. There's many ways. There's many assessments, but this is just one. That is all I have for today. Any questions that come up, anything that you'd like to discuss, please respond to me. You can respond to me into the course room or send me an email. I'm always available here, well, during working hours. And as always, it's a pleasure to make these videos, and I hope that you find them beneficial and helpful.